Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we're going to be talking about intelligence of the heart, something that all indigenous peoples insist their knowledge of plant medicines come from the plants themselves and not through trial and error or experimentation. I know that seems like a leap, but the idea of knowing that plants have intelligence, that we can connect and come to understand each other, after all, we live on a planet where we live in complete symbiosis. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is earth poet and senior researcher for the Foundation for Gaian Studies, who lectures throughout the United States on herbal medicine and sacredness of plants and the intelligence of nature. He is author of 9 works, including 1 book of poetry, and today we're going to be talking about his book, The Secret Teachings of Plants. In the direct perception of nature, we're going to learn how we can pursue this intelligence of the heart. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Stephen Booner. Stephen, how are you today?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me on today.
You bet. How did all this start for you, this interest in plants?
Well, it's more, the root of it is really more just a certain kind of relationship with nature. I'm 62, born in 52, and I spent a lot of time in rural Indiana with my great-grandfather, who was a physician who began practice in 1911. And so there was this kind of experience that we would share just walking through the woods there and being with each other, that it was a kind of thing that I wanted to experience a lot in my life. I suppose that sort of set the stage for it. And he'd been trained just simply because of when he had trained as a physician. He used mostly botanic medicines in his practice because antibiotics weren't really common until 1946. So that sort of set the stage for it. And then when I left home, I actually spent a lot of my life pursuing that kind of experience, where with that kind of feeling, and then it just slowly developed from there.
Now you can imagine in the animal world that ultimately it starts with plants and nurturing that world, so you see the symbiosis there, but I don't think people tend to look at it that way as often as they should.
Well, most people are trained to think of human beings as the most intelligent organism on the planet, and and then there's sort of this hierarchy of intelligence. Maybe it's dolphins or chimpanzees after that, and then it sort of goes down through the fur-bearing animals, then maybe parrots and ravens, and you go all the way down to maybe a microbe or a rock, because they're awfully stupid apparently, but that's not actually a very accurate view of the way the world works. That in fact, neural networks, the same kind of ones that we have in our brain, form with every living organism that there is. So it turns out plants have a neural network as complicated and many times much larger than our own. For us, we have an organ called the brain, and our neural network is held inside there. But for plants, it's their root system that is the brain, and that it looks, if you look at a picture of it, it looks exactly like our neural net. They use the same neurotransmitters that we do. They store memories, and they plan for the future. So we have about 86 billion neurons in our brain, but there's a number of plant systems that dwarf ours considerably, aspen root systems that cover several hundred acres and are over 100,000 years old. So it's mostly, the problem is that the picture that we're given of the world and of plants really comes from the late 19th and early 20th century. It doesn't, unfortunately for us, have much to do with the actuality of the world.
Mm-hmm. I know that just not too long ago we did a wonderful segment. It was on, I'm trying to remember now, he was the Japanese biologist, agriculturalist, who actually created what was known during its time as organic farming. And, it was The One Straw Revolution was the name of his book. And I remember as I was reading this, it was really a fascinating yet simple read, is that just one day he stepped out and realized that nature was perfect by itself. And you take a look at how nature balances itself, especially in the plant kingdom, and it's really quite a fascinating thing, not only to experience, but embrace and to know that there it is. It's all there to take care of you, and it takes quite a bit of intelligence for something like that to be self-creating in many ways.
Well, the guy you're talking about was Masanobu Fukuoka. He died a few years ago, and his work's been really influential for my own. I mean, one of the things that he said was, he'd been a gardener and a scientific agriculturist, and he was walking out one day and he noticed that this life force was just flowing from the earth up through that tree, and it didn't need any help from human beings at all. So he began to try to grow plants and do agriculture in that way, which he eventually succeeded. So his insights, along with a lot of other people I talk about in The Secret Teachings of Plants, for instance, Goethe, Luther Burbank, a lot of people all talked about it in much the same way. And really the root of it for human beings that go more deeply into it, every time what it is they have some sort of deep epiphany or deep experience of plants where the plants are no longer sort of a vegetable, an insentient vegetable just sort of sitting there, but they all of a sudden have this deep experience of the intelligence, and not only that, the capacity of plants to communicate with human beings, and a kind of a deep relationship and a dialogue begins there, and really a most amazing journey occurs.
Now, plants are psychic, I guess is the best way that I could put this. Is that something that rings true?
That's not actually the way that I would look at it, though I understand what you mean by that. And a lot of people might go in that particular kind of direction. And there's a number of ways to sort of get to it. The thing is, all living... How
about intuitive, then?
Intuitive.
Well, I was trying to base this because you talk quite a bit in your book about the heart, especially as a perceptual organ, and how that relates to the plant world. And this is the way that I think that communication occurs, even though it's nonverbal. Where's the wavelength where we actually connect with the plant and it does the same thing back with us?
Right. Well, to back up a little bit then and look at the heart as an organ of perception, most ancient and indigenous peoples, if they were asked where they lived in their body, they would gesture to the region of the chest. And we're really the first culture in the West, these Western cultures, where if you ask somebody where they live in their body, they're usually going to point about an inch above their eyebrows, and, they feel it's like about 2 inches into the skull from that. But that's a relatively modern phenomenon, and it turns out consciousness is extremely fluid. It can locate to any of the large biological oscillators in the body. The heart is the most powerful one, and as it beats, it produces this electromagnetic field that's 5,000 times stronger than the brain's. And so there's this electromagnetic field that's strongest at about 12 to 18 inches from the body, but it continues out pretty much indefinitely beyond that. One of the things that happens, and everybody's had this kind of experience where, there's kind of two ways to talk about it. One is, you're walking with a friend on the sidewalk, and the two of you then start walking in synchrony with each other. You match your strides. And if you intentionally mix up your stride, it's very disorienting to people. We have a natural ability to synchronize our movements. And the other thing is, for instance, people have a real experience of the heart field, though they don't call it that. If what they know of it is like when somebody's in your space. If somebody gets closer than about 18 to 12 inches, you can feel they're sort of in your space, and that's where they're inside the strongest extension of your heart field. So one of the things that I looked at in depth in that particular book was that when people go to sit with plants and work with plants more deeply, whether you're talking about indigenous peoples or Goethe, or Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize for her work with corn transposons, or Masanobu Fukuoka, one of the things that they did is that they would essentially establish that same kind of synchronization with the plant. So they kind of slow down, the plant kind of speeds up a little bit, and what happens is the two electromagnetic fields that both organisms have synchronize with each other, and in that moment there's this tremendous exchange of information that goes both ways, from the person to the plant and from the plant to the person. James Hillman, who was a rather remarkable man, he said the ancient Greeks called that moment of synchronization like that a moment of aesthesis. It's where, once you're touched and you're touching like that, you can feel something leave your body and something, coming from out there entering your body, and it's, accompanied by this gasp or this deep inspiration, this breathing in, and it's the moment where there's this exchange of soul essence between a human and a life form outside themselves. And for the ancient Athenians, that was where true inspiration came. But once you have that kind of bonding or synchrony with another living organism, whether it's your dog or your mate or a plant, there's a massive exchange of information that can become phenomenally sophisticated and extremely deep if you wish to take it that far.
I always found it incredible to think of the shaman, for instance, and how, they, of course, are the healing center of a particular group of people. And when it comes to, let's say, the medicinal properties of plants, how they came to know what the right ones were. For instance, if you're in, the forests of the Borneo or the Amazon basin, there's such a diversity of plant life down there. It's just one step in the wrong direction, you've got trouble, or in the step in the right direction, you have healing. How they came to know these connections, and the only way I personally could think of is, because I have been someone who's been a lucid dreamer for many, many years, is that maybe somehow the plants came into their dreams somehow and spoke to them, that there was that connection, that electromagnetic energy that you were talking about, where only in the dream worlds it could be perceived by a human brain in such a way to make sense. Does that kind of seem accurate, or maybe give us a little more detail on something like that?
Well, you're really touching on some of the true elements of it. It is kind of a dreaming state, but it's more the state that you're in when you're driving your car someplace that you've been a million times, and some deep part of you drives the car, and then you get there but you don't remember the trip, or like when if you're juggling or something like that, you go into kind of this other kind of mental state where you're not using your thinking mind so much, but you're feeling the things around you, and it's that feeling dynamic that's really crucial. And it's like it's a very sophisticatedly developed sensing mechanism for people in ancient and indigenous cultures. For instance, everybody's had this experience of you're going to a restaurant you've never been to before, and you walk in the door and you look around and you go, ooh, this place feels kind of funny, let's leave. And it's that, what I mean, it's not the same as emotions, it's a feeling sense.
Right.
So what happens is all of the indigenous people, when they were asked where they learned the use of their plant medicines, they would always say the same thing. Well, the plant told me, or it came in a vision or a dream somehow. But the dream state they're talking about is not the same one that we have when we're asleep. It's sort of like their conscious mind just sort of turns off in a way, and they're in that more kind of feeling, dreaming state, and the information just is sort of downloaded into them about how the plants get used. And what's fascinating is, in my first book, Sacred Plant Medicine, I looked at it from that orientation of, firsthand accounts from indigenous peoples all around the world, and they all found similar uses for plant medicines. And, and scientists are always making up, well, of course it was trial and error, but you have to get, trial and error is not the thing that's going to make this work. You have to imagine the very first guy in the world ever who used plants for healing, and let's say he cuts himself very badly and he's bleeding, and then he goes, oh, maybe if I put a plant on it, it'll help. That's a huge leap right there, okay? But
should I eat this? Will this be good for me, kind of a thing.
Right, and so then you just imagine the guy, but then how does he discover which plant? So if it's trial and error, he's bleeding really bad, he's running through the forest, and he's trying this and this and this and that and that, and nothing works until he happens upon yarrow, and then he picks some yarrow, first bruising it so the juice will liberally enter the wound, and then he puts it on there, and it stops the bleeding, and then he he goes tells his family, and in a similar way, all in cultures on Earth found out the use of yarrow. But this doesn't really make sense when you look into it. And if you ask them, in which many people who were traveling out from more colonizing cultures would interview them and say, where did you learn these? And they always said, every time, the plant told me, or it came into me in a dream or a vision. So you have to there's some other mechanism for learning about the world than what we use, what we consider to be the sort of reductive trial and error science. It's a very different world out there.
And speaking of different worlds, I remember years ago when I picked up my first copy of a Carlos Castaneda book, which was The Teachings of Don Juan, and he talks about 3 different types of plants that he uses for different perceptions of reality. And the one that I really found fascinating was the one on the mescalito, when they went out to actually collect this. And he was explaining to Carlos, Don Juan was, that you'll get to a point as you're beginning to take this off the land that this bag will become very, very heavy. And what it is that's mescalito trying to stay, in its own neighborhood. But once you get past a particular invisible border area, all of a sudden it'll become light. And I thought, it was just fascinating how he was describing, there was a doTERRA root, and the other one was a little smoke mixture made from a mushroom. And it was just fascinating to hear the details in this and what each of these properties of each of these plants brought to you. They were all different, very unique. And that a lot of times when people think about plant intelligence, perhaps, or the teachings of plants, they tend to kind of look at, I guess, the psychedelic side of things. I mean, right now we're in the big marijuana controversy, so to speak. Should this be legalized? What does it do? What does it don't do? But the fact which is basically a weed, specifically, got so much attention.
Well, it is really fascinating that sort of out of nowhere in the late 1950s, all of these hallucinogenic plants just sort of showed up in the Western awareness, and they'd been around for hundreds of millions of years already, so it's not exactly, they have to have been doing something out there besides waiting for us to notice.
Have their own sort of Oscar ceremony every year.
And so the thing is, every plant has a personality, just like every person has a personality, and there's a big dynamic involved in making deep relationship with them, and learning not to be in sort of a hierarchy of importance. In the most recent book I wrote, which is Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm, I look in that particular work a lot at the work of Barbara McClintock, and she was the world's leading geneticist, and she won the Nobel Prize for her work with corn transposons in 1983. But she was very specific. She said, look, to do the kind of work I did, the very first thing is you must have a feeling for the organism. Mm-hmm. Then you must learn to see. You have to learn to see what's right in front of you, because plants are not anything like what we've been taught. And the third thing she said was, I never went any place that the corn did not first tell me to go. In other words, she allowed the corn to teach her. And, Basho, the Japanese poet from quite a long time ago, said, if you wish to learn about the pine, go to the pine. If you wish to learn bamboo, go to the bamboo. So there's this very ancient tradition of human beings letting go of sort of their arrogance and hubris and being willing to be taught directly by the plants. But because, of course, the plants know their medicine better than anybody else does, and that's the way people have always found it out until, kind of recently.
It must sometimes, I would think, be alarming for you, what you know about the plant kingdom and what you're learning, to take a look at something like genetically modified organisms. How does that sit with you?
Well, the thing is, that question comes up often for me, but the thing is, I know so much about genetic mingling in plants that particular dynamic doesn't bother me that much. For instance, mosquitoes and viruses, when we, for instance, if we ingest a virus somehow, whether it's through a mosquito or for food or something like that. One of the functions of viruses is they snip off little bits of DNA, and then they leave little bits of DNA in its place. So if you examine the human genome, we actually have plant DNA, bacterial DNA, viral DNA, all kinds of DNA woven in there. So we're really a blend of many different types of organisms. So it's not as if genetically modified organisms is a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
The real problem that it gets down to is human beings don't know enough to be messing about with all of this stuff. It's like if you really start looking at the research, and for every book I write, I usually read anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 journal articles in the research. And after doing that for 5 or 6 books, you begin to get a real feel for that sort of world. And the thing is, truly, these are some not very bright people, and they are extremely arrogant for the most part, and they don't have a very good sense of the way the world really works. So what will happen over time is that they'll unleash these sort of repercussions in the natural world that's not going to be troubling to the earth, but it's going to be very troubling to human culture, because it's going to result in very strange dynamics that we're not really prepared to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, as you've been doing your research and producing your book, Stephen, is what has been, if possible, the single plant that was the most fascinating to you?
Yeah, that's a nearly impossible question.
I figured it would be, but I thought I'd take a shot.
So many of them are so remarkable. So just a few of them. For instance, pine trees, which most people don't think about. Well, pine pollen is... I
actually have a beautiful one right outside my house. So.
Right, well, pine pollen, is extremely high in testosterone. It's the molecularly, pharmaceutically identical, chemically identical to the testosterone in our bodies. So that, that's... Once I began to understand that, I began to look at using tincture of pine pollen to help men in middle age increase their testosterone levels, because they tend to drop then. Mm-hmm. But then if you look at flowers, for instance, the reproductive system in a flower is virtually identical to that in human women. And the thing is, flowers menstruate just like human women do, only in flowers it's nectar. And what it does is it sterilizes the passageways in the flower that keeps them from becoming infected. So once you start to see these kind of patterns, it's really the patterns that I see in a lot of ways that's more phenomenal to me than the plants themselves in terms of their individuality. I've had many deep experiences, personal experiences with plants, whether it's Osha or Angelica or pine, a lot of different ones, but it's more seeing how the patterns in the plant kingdom preceded our emergence here, and in a way we're just a modification of plants. We're not really that unique.
So Swamp Thing was probably a real creature.
A swamp thing. Well, yeah, if you've ever been to Louisiana, you know it's a real creature.
What do you hope people most get from your books?
What I really hope most people get is to understand that it's their capacity to feel that gives them that bond and that connection with the natural world. Over the last 35 years of my teaching, when I teach workshops and speak, it's invariably true that somebody will come up after the workshop or during a break and say, thank you so much for talking about this, because for many years I thought I was really crazy because I could feel all these communications from the natural world, and everybody kept telling me I was making it up. And that thing, there's a more ancient way of knowing this deeper bond of connection with the world that's possible through our feeling sense for all human beings. And really, it's the most natural thing to us. Children do it automatically. Little girls sit under trees talking with flowers all the time. You see, children know that the world is intelligent, alive, and aware. Mm-hmm. They have to be told over and over and over again before they finally begin to give up that belief.
I know it was a marvelous thing to grow up with a mother that was very free thinking, just like that, where she allowed the imagination, the stories to pour forth. And it gets to a point where you actually can feel and perceive the world in that wonderful way that you think, why not have the conversation? I mean, it couldn't be any worse than having a conversation with somebody who might be a little nuts, but it's still enjoyable nevertheless.
Well, it's a wonderful thing. You see, so many people are taking antidepressants of various sorts now because they feel isolated. Robert Bly had a great way of putting it years ago. He said, we've been taught that we're just on a ball of resources hurtling around the sun, and so human beings live abandoned inside their own house, and occasionally they look out the windows at an environment with which they have no meaningful contact. And there's a reason why so many people in the West feel their lives are meaningless, and it's that reconnectivity of the feeling sense to the world that really allows us to know we're companioned by intelligent, aware, and souled phenomena, that we're not really alone that way.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I find fascinating, too, is when you bring up the West and the way that we tend to think we should be living. It's all about success and material gain, it seems like. And when you take a look at people who, for instance, may not have achieved for what their neighbors have, you try that keeping up with the Joneses ideal, and they think, I lack. I just don't have enough. There just isn't enough abundance. But yet you take a look at the plant world itself and you find out that you're incredibly abundant for everything that you'll ever need. It's just a matter of mastering yourself enough to have that awareness to know how to have the kind of respect to live in a world like that.
Well, we're really trained to orient ourselves towards surfaces. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, it seems that there's a hunger inside people because they can't. There's a great phrase by a German poet, Gottfried Benn, who said, people in the West, they're unable to experience the metaphysical background of the world. They can't go deeper than surfaces. And so when we're stuck in surfaces and oriented there, we have to judge things and what we have by that. But if you can begin to go below the surface of things and rekindle the aesthetic sense, what Gregory Bateson said, we've lost the capacity or our sense of aesthetic unity in the West, in this culture. And that sense of aesthetic unity then is basically touching the deeper components inside of a thing. And once you do that, you can begin to craft a life that's extremely full of meaning, and it's very rewarding, and it doesn't then depend upon the accumulation of a lot of stuff. How much you get then it's different for everybody, but it doesn't mean that you're impoverished. It just means that you're oriented along a different kind of aesthetic value.
Absolutely. The book is The Secret Teachings of Plants. Our guest today, Stephen Booner. Is there a website people can find out more about your work?
Sure, it's GaianStudies.org, GAIAN studies.org.
And will you have that pine elixir there for people who are in midlife?
Oh, I don't sell that stuff, but there's a lot of people around the country selling it now, and it works awfully well.
Sounds great. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Okay, thanks so much.
You bet. So you can find out more, GaiaStudies.org, and you can find out more about that and the secret teachings of plants. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.